Emma Carter, 30 years old, carried the weight of a decade in uniform. Her voice was calm, precise, and steady, the kind of voice that had delivered orders on battlefields scattered across the Middle East and Africa. She had guided soldiers through sandstorms, ambushes, and midnight extractions, always choosing words that steadied fear and inspired trust. To the men and women who served under her, Emma was not just a major. She was the anchor they clung to when chaos closed in. But at home, her voice carried no weight. To Richard Carter, her father, her achievements in the U.S. Army meant little more than wasted years. Where generals saluted her, Richard scoffed. Where soldiers trusted her with their lives, her father dismissed her as a daughter who had strayed from his carefully laid path. Emma had fought wars in foreign deserts, but her quietest, most painful battle was the one she fought every day. The unseen war for her father's respect, a war she was never allowed to win. The chandeliers glittered above the marble hall, casting golden light over rows of wine glasses and polished silver. Men in tailored suits and women in evening gowns whispered about deals worth billions. At the head of the long oak table sat Richard Carter, his presence commanding every glance in the room. Beside him, Emma sat in her neatly pressed dress uniform, a deliberate choice, a reminder that she belonged to a different world. Richard raised his glass, flashing the sharp smile that had built his empire. "And here is my daughter," he announced, gesturing toward her. "While the rest of us shape industries and run the world, she spends her days playing soldier." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, polite yet cruel. Emma's jaw tightened, her hands folding neatly in her lap. The politicians and CEOs leaned forward, amused by Richard's performance. He relished the attention, basking in their nods and chuckles. To them, Emma was just a curiosity, a decorated officer reduced to a dinner joke. She said nothing, her eyes steady, her back straight. Years of discipline held her in place, but inside the sting cut deep. She had faced warlords and assassins, yet somehow, sitting at that table, she felt more exposed than ever. As the evening chatter rose, Emma's soldier's instincts sharpened. Her gaze swept the hall the way it had so many times before on foreign soil, checking corners, exits, unfamiliar faces. Then she saw him. A tall man in a tailored black suit, standing too still at the edge of the crowd. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were predatory. Emma's stomach tightened. She recognized him instantly, the contract killer known in classified reports as Victor Kessler. She had once studied his file in the dim light of an intelligence tent, learning his methods. Patient, silent, untraceable. Kessler never missed his mark. And now, his focus was locked on General Matthew Hayes, the Army Chief of Staff, who sat laughing across the table, unaware of the danger. Emma's pulse quickened, but her face betrayed nothing. To the others, she remained the soldier daughter, enduring her father's mockery. But inside, every calculation raced. The assassin's angle, the timing, the security gaps. One wrong move could turn this glittering dinner into a blood-soaked memory. She didn't have minutes, she had seconds. And once again, Emma Carter found herself on a battlefield no one else could see. Emma didn't flinch. To anyone watching, she looked like a bored daughter enduring another tedious dinner. But beneath the tablecloth, her fingers moved with trained precision. She unlocked her encrypted device. Standard issue, invisible to most, deadly effective in her hands. The glowing screen reflected briefly in her eyes as she typed only 6 words. "Get up and leave now." She routed the message through a secure military channel, bypassing the usual chatter of aides and staff. On the far side of the table, General Matthew Hayes glanced at his phone. For the briefest second, his brow furrowed. Then, without hesitation, he rose from his chair. The room stilled. Conversations faltered as the 4-star general excused himself without explanation, his aides quickly moving to follow. Forks paused in midair. Richard Carter's smile froze on his face. He looked from Hayes to his daughter, confusion flickering into irritation. Emma remained composed, her expression unreadable, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. In that silent moment a shift occurred. Where her father's words had belittled her, a man commanding entire divisions of the U.S. Army had obeyed her instantly. And Richard Carter, for once, had no clever remark. The glittering dinner carried on, waiters gliding between tables with trays of wine and silver platters. Laughter and clinking glasses masked the tension only a handful of people could sense. Near the entrance, General Hayes's aides moved with casual grace, as if merely stretching their legs. In reality, every step was calculated, every glance rehearsed. Victor Kessler barely shifted his weight before they were on him. One aide brushed past, slipping a hand beneath the assassin's jacket and disarming him with a motion so quick it could have been mistaken for adjusting a cufflink. Another clasped Kessler's arm as though greeting an old friend, locking his muscles in place. Within seconds, the man feared by governments across continents was escorted out. His silence intact, his presence unnoticed by most of the room. Emma sipped her wine slowly, her eyes never leaving her father's smug expression. Richard Carter was too wrapped up in his own performance to realize what had just transpired under his nose. The chandeliers still glowed, the violins still played, the business elites still toasted to profits and power. Yet Emma knew, just beneath that polished surface, she had stopped a disaster that could have ignited headlines, toppled careers, and cost countless lives. It was the kind of battle she was born for, one fought in silence, with victory known only to those who understood the stakes. Morning sunlight spilled across the manicured lawns of Richard Carter's vast estate, the kind of fortress built to project untouchable wealth and power. Servants prepared breakfast in silence, while Richard readied himself for another day of commanding boardrooms and bending politicians to his will. But the calm shattered in an instant. Engines roared at the front gates. Black SUVs rolled onto the driveway, their tires grinding gravel like thunder. Within seconds, armed Interpol agents in dark vests poured out, their voices sharp and commanding. "Interpol! Stay where you are!" The mansion staff froze in terror as the agents stormed inside, boots striking marble floors with relentless rhythm. Richard descended the staircase, fury flashing in his eyes. "Do you know who I am?" he barked, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who had always been above consequence. The lead agent didn't flinch. He held up a crisp photograph, Richard Carter, smiling as he shook hands with Victor Kessler, the same assassin Emma had spotted the night before. The evidence was undeniable. For the first time in decades, Richard's composure cracked. His empire, built on deals hidden in shadows, began to crumble in broad daylight. The power he had wielded with a word or a handshake slipped from his grasp, and in its place, the cold hand of justice closed in. Upstairs, unseen, Emma watched from the balcony, her face unreadable. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply understood. The war between them had shifted, and this time she hadn't fired a single shot. That evening, Emma sat alone in her modest apartment, the city lights flickering through the window. The noise of sirens and traffic below blended into a distant hum, a stark contrast to the quiet clarity in her mind. She replayed the dinner in her head. Not her father's mocking laughter, not the shallow smiles of businessmen, but the moment General Matthew Hayes had obeyed her command without hesitation. 4 years, Richard Carter's voice had echoed louder than any battlefield. His words had cut deeper than bullets, branding her as insignificant, just a soldier in a world of titans. But now reality had shifted. A man who commanded armies had trusted her judgment instantly. Her father, the self-proclaimed master of influence, had been powerless in that moment, left speechless, watching as Emma's authority spoke for itself. Emma realized revenge was not about breaking her father down. nor about watching his empire collapse. True revenge was balance, the scales tipping back to where they belonged. Richard had tried to measure her worth in wealth and status. The world had measured her worth in trust, discipline, and quiet strength. For the first time, she felt no need to prove anything more. The battlefield had answered for her. Emma remembered the smell of fresh coffee and the soft hum of her mother's favorite records filling the kitchen on quiet mornings. Her mother, Grace Carter, had always been her safe harbor, gentle, perceptive, and quietly strong. When Emma first whispered her dream of joining the army, Grace had smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "If this is where your heart leads you, then it's where you belong," she had said, tucking a strand of hair behind Emma's ear. But Richard Carter had other plans. In his eyes, Emma's future was already scripted. A prestigious business school, a polished role in his empire, and eventually a seat at his side in boardrooms filled with power. To him, the military was a distraction, a waste of potential. Their arguments had been endless, Emma standing firm, Richard dismissing her as reckless and naive. Then, without warning, Grace was gone. A sudden illness took her from their lives, leaving Emma stranded in a house that no longer felt like home. Without her mother's gentle voice to shield her, Emma stood alone against her father's iron will. The bond of understanding that had once balanced their family vanished, and the divide between father and daughter deepened into a chasm. It was in those lonely nights, staring at the ceiling, that Emma learned the first rule of survival. Fight your battles, even when you're the only one on your side. The house that once echoed with her mother's laughter soon felt like a stranger's mansion. Within a year, Richard remarried. A polished socialite named Victoria who fit seamlessly into his world of galas and boardrooms. Emma was barely 20 then, still in her first years of service, and her presence no longer seemed required. Family dinners grew fewer, then disappeared altogether. Holidays became a quiet ache. While Richard hosted extravagant gatherings with Victoria and her circle of friends, Emma spent Christmases on base with fellow soldiers or overseas with her unit. Birthdays passed without calls. The gap between them widened not with a single argument but with the slow, steady erosion of contact. Emma poured herself into the army, building a family of comrades who understood sacrifice in a way Richard never could. Meanwhile, her father's empire expanded. His life filled with champagne toasts, photo ops, and magazine covers. They existed like two planets in separate orbits, close enough to be aware of each other's gravity, but destined never to meet. For Emma, estrangement became less about anger and more about acceptance. She no longer waited for the phone to ring. She stopped expecting him at milestones. She built her strength in the silence he left behind. The army became Emma's true home, a place where rank was earned, not inherited, and respect was measured by action, not wealth. From the deserts of Afghanistan to the dense jungles of Africa, she learned to lead under fire. Her first missions were small: convoy escorts, intelligence gathering, coordination with local allies. But each assignment hardened her resolve and sharpened her instincts. She was never the loudest voice in the room, never the officer who boasted about victories. Instead, she became known for her calm under pressure. When others panicked, Emma calculated. When missions went sideways, she adapted. Her soldiers trusted her not because she promised survival, but because she fought beside them in the mud, carrying the same weight, facing the same dangers. Over the years, her quiet consistency carried her upward. Captain, then major. She earned ribbons and commendations, but what mattered more were the men and women who followed her without hesitation. Emma didn't need to demand loyalty. She inspired it. In faraway places where her father's name meant nothing, Emma Carter built a legacy of her own, one forged in grit, sacrifice, and unshakable trust. Years had passed since Emma had last set foot in her father's world of polished marble and power suits. She had buried herself in duty, missions, and the steady rhythm of military life, expecting little more than silence from Richard. That was why the letter surprised her. A formal, handwritten invitation sealed with the Carter family crest. No phone call, no explanation, just a line in her father's unmistakable hand. "Join me for dinner. It's important." Emma studied the note for a long time. Suspicion gnawed at her. Richard Carter never did anything without motive, and his sudden interest felt less like reconciliation and more like strategy. Still, something in the choice of words, important, made her hesitate. Perhaps it was business, perhaps a performance, or perhaps something else entirely. Against her instincts, she accepted. When she arrived at the Grand Hall that evening, dressed once more in her crisp uniform, she noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere. The air hummed with anticipation, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Richard greeted her with a polished smile, offering no clues. But Emma had lived long enough in the shadows of war to recognize the feeling tightening in her chest. Whatever this dinner was about, it wasn't just family. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the grand ballroom, scattering light across velvet curtains and polished marble floors. Waiters in white gloves moved with practiced elegance, serving champagne and hors d'oeuvres to men and women whose laughter was as sharp as their ambition. Richard Carter stood at the center of it all, perfectly in his element, commanding attention with every handshake and calculated smile. Emma moved through the crowd quietly, her uniform again setting her apart from the sea of gowns and tuxedos. To most, she was an outlier, an odd choice for such a gathering. But Emma's eyes weren't on the decor or the deals being whispered over glasses of Bordeaux. They scanned the room the way they always did. Exits, blind spots, faces. And then she saw him. Victor Kessler. The assassin's presence was like a shadow in the glow of chandeliers. Silent, patient, out of place yet invisible to everyone else. He lingered near the far corner, pretending to study a painting, but his eyes gave him away. Emma followed his gaze and felt her pulse tighten. General Hayes was here again, seated at Richard's table, completely unaware he was being watched by death itself. A cold realization settled over her. Her father was tied to this, whether through ignorance or intent. The thought cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Richard Carter might be hosting more than a dinner. He might be hosting a setup. The air in the ballroom felt suddenly heavy, as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Emma's instincts screamed at her. She didn't have minutes, only seconds. Beneath the cover of polite conversation, she slipped her phone from her uniform pocket and opened the encrypted channel. Her fingers moved with steady precision, typing just 5 words. "Leave the room. Now." Across the table, General Hayes glanced at his phone. His years of command had taught him to recognize urgency without explanation. Without hesitation, he rose to his feet. His aides followed immediately, shielding him with casual precision as they moved him toward the exit. Their departure was smooth, but to the trained eye, it was deliberate, decisive. Victor Kessler's jaw tightened. His eyes tracked Hayes, his plan dissolving into nothing. By the time he shifted his stance, it was too late. The window of opportunity had closed. He faded into the background, forced to retreat into the crowd. His mission undone. Richard Carter, however, noticed something else. His carefully curated dinner, his perfect stage, had been disrupted. He turned to his daughter, eyes narrowing, suspicion flickering behind his polished smile. Something about Emma had shifted the balance of the room. He didn't know how or why, but for the first time, Richard sensed that the daughter he had mocked might wield more power than he ever imagined. The storm broke within days. Headlines splashed across international news. Carter Industries under investigation. Interpol uncovers shadow contracts. Billionaire linked to armed militias. The empire Richard Carter had built over decades unraveled in the glare of cameras and subpoenas. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and payments to violent private contractors. All laid bare. What had once been whispered rumors were now ironclad evidence. Interpol agents returned, this time not as uninvited guests but as executioners of justice. Board members resigned. Business partners cut ties. The man who had once walked into any room as the untouchable king of industry was now reduced to a defendant scrambling to salvage scraps of dignity. Emma faced him in his study, the room lined with leather-bound books and walls that had witnessed countless arguments between them. Richard's face was pale, his voice hoarse with rage and desperation. "This is your doing," he hissed, his once commanding tone cracking under the weight of collapse. Emma stood tall, her uniform crisp, her gaze unwavering. "Not me, you did this." Her words were steady, like a verdict already sealed. For years he had mocked her path, dismissing her choices as insignificant. Yet here he was, brought down not by her vengeance, but by his own corruption. The silence that followed was heavier than any battlefield. Richard Carter, the man who had believed himself untouchable, had finally been brought to his knees, by his own hand. The courtroom was packed, journalists filling the benches, cameras waiting outside, the air thick with anticipation. Richard Carter sat at the defense table, his tailored suit doing little to mask the fatigue in his face. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the man commanding the room. He was the man on trial. Emma took the witness stand with the same composure she carried onto battlefields. She adjusted the microphone, her posture straight, her eyes steady. There was no anger in her voice, no need for theatrics. When the prosecutor asked her to describe what she knew, she answered with precision. The shell companies hidden behind fake charities, the staged corridors in war-torn countries where Richard's contractors had fueled chaos, and the ruthless financier who had funded violence under the guise of business. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer. Offshore ledgers, intercepted communications, photographs of meetings Richard had sworn never happened. And through it all, Emma's testimony cut through the defense's attempts to discredit her. She wasn't there as a bitter daughter. She was there as a soldier, an officer sworn to truth. The jury watched her intently, their expressions shifting as her words stripped away the illusion of Richard Carter's power. Even the judge leaned forward, listening closely. In that solemn chamber, Emma's quiet voice carried more weight than all of her father's wealth and influence combined. For once, the world saw Richard not as a titan of industry, but as a man exposed. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day peeling back another layer of Richard Carter's empire. Witnesses spoke, documents piled high, and the once proud businessman grew smaller in the shadow of mounting evidence. His legal team fought with polished words, but even their arguments began to sound hollow against the relentless tide of proof. Then, on a gray morning heavy with rain, Richard surprised them all. When the judge called the court to order, his attorney rose and announced that the defendant wished to change his plea. Gasps rippled through the room as Richard stood, his face pale, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Guilty," he said. The word hung in the air like a final toll of a bell. He admitted to the laundering, the secret accounts, the ties to violent contractors. But in the same breath, he made a demand. His employees and family members, those who had only followed orders or lived under his shadow, were not to be prosecuted. It was the first time in decades Richard had used his power not to protect himself, but to shield others. For Emma it was a strange moment. She did not forgive him, but she recognized the fragile humanity that flickered in his choice. The titan of industry, the man who mocked her life's work, had finally lowered his armor. Not out of love, perhaps, but out of a final, fleeting sense of responsibility. It was the closest thing to redemption Richard Carter would ever claim. A year had passed since the trial. Life had settled into a new rhythm for Emma. Early mornings on base, long hours mentoring younger officers, the steady comfort of purpose. She rarely thought of her father anymore, except when headlines mentioned his downfall in passing. To her, Richard Carter had become part of a closed chapter. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived. The paper was thick, the handwriting unmistakably his. No seal of wealth or power this time, just the ink of a prisoner's hand. Emma sat at her desk, staring at it for a long moment before breaking it open. Inside, the letter was brief. "I never thought you had that kind of strength. Not the kind to fight wars, but the kind to stand against me. Part of me hates you for it. And part of me is glad. If you hadn't stopped that assassin, Hayes would be dead, and I'd be buried deeper in the lies I built. You ended it, even though it destroyed me." The words were uneven, scratched as though written through clenched teeth. Yet they carried something Emma had never seen from him before. Honesty stripped of performance. For the first time, Richard Carter admitted his daughter had been stronger than him. Emma folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply set it aside, knowing that his words were not a bridge to reconciliation, but an echo from a man finally facing his own ruins. Emma placed the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into a drawer, unopened to the world. She knew she would never respond. Richard's words, however raw, were not an invitation for reconciliation, only a confession from a man who had finally run out of places to hide. For years, Emma had measured herself against his approval, as though his recognition were the final proof of her worth. Now she saw how hollow that pursuit had been. Her worth had never rested in his hands. It was in the soldiers who trusted her with their lives, in the missions she had led to success, in the quiet strength she carried through every battle. It was in the moment she sent a single text that prevented blood from staining a chandelier-lit hall. She did not need Richard Carter to validate any of it. One evening, she walked through the Defense Service Library, where the names of decorated officers were etched into stone. Among them she found her own. Running her fingers over the carved letters, she felt a calm certainty settle within her. This was her legacy. Not wealth, not boardrooms, not hollow applause. Emma Carter had chosen her ground. And in standing firm she had already won.